Alaska's economy is, and it's a dirty word to some people, but it's a colonial economy. Since the time of Western contact, since the first Russians shot the first seal in 1740, Alaska's economic development has been about someone with outside capital, larger than the people that actually live here, investing money, expecting a return on that investment to extract resources and leave behind as little as they could for the people that actually live here and want to build a permanent economy with it. That's what I'm here for, to help represent the people that live here, to build a permanent economy in a fair division. I think numbers and facts and past history and precedent are important, and we need to have an honest conversation. And when it gets emotional, and interestingly, it's emotional on the industry side. If you don't take our position, you're against the gas line. You're trying to drive away investment. You're going to harm the people. It's like, no, we're talking really about the margins here. We're talking about the last 5 or 10% of dividing up a very large thing. And I think we deserve honest information and honest representation.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Ken Alper, who served as the director of the tax division during Governor Bill Walker's administration. After earning a master's degree in urban planning at the University of Washington, Ken and his wife, Jill, relocated to Juneau in the early 90s, where they bought the Silver Bow Inn, which they still own. Once their business was thriving, Ken took a job with the Department of Fish and Game at the tail end of Governor Tony Knowles' administration, a position he remained in during the Murkowski administration. In 2006, he went to work as a legislative staffer for former representative and current chair of the Alaska Democratic Party, Eric Croft. Ken has since worked for a total of 12 different legislators over 17 sessions. He is currently staff to Representative Andy Josephson, co-chair of the House Finance Committee. Ken Alper, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Representative Gray. It's great to be here.
Tell us about your early life. Where did you grow up?
I'm from New Jersey. My parents are both New York City people. They took the subway to college. They met there. They got married and moved to the suburbs, which is a pretty conventional thing at the time. My parents were married on the day after the Kennedy assassination.
And you grew up in a suburb?
In the suburbs in New Jersey, in a very typical upper middle class bubble, yeah.
What did your parents do?
My father is a real estate developer. He built industrial buildings, warehouses, that sort of thing in New Jersey and also in Texas. Became pretty successful at that. Mom was a teacher and then stayed home after she had kids. I have a younger brother who lives in Massachusetts right now. Gotcha. He owns a couple of music clubs and has been a small home builder as well.
Did you grow up in a religious family?
No, not at all. My family is Jewish, but very secular, very assimilated, but very urban. Like no one hunted, no one fished, or any of those sorts of things. So that the idea that I'm here in Alaska for these past 30 years is a little bit unusual.
Did you grow up in a Democratic household?
My parents weren't overtly political, and my father, like a lot of upwardly mobile guys, thought of himself as a conservative because he's trying to protect his own taxes. But as he got older and in his heart of hearts, he was pretty much progressive. My father's middle name was Franklin. He was named after President Roosevelt. My grandfather, who was the son of Eastern European Jewish immigrants and sort of a proud American. And I remember him, I'd vote for Mickey Mouse if he was the Democrat. Like he was a true New York machine Democrat. My mother's family, neutral. They're not particularly political people. My mother comes from a mixed marriage. So by traditionally speaking, I'm 3/4 Jewish. My mother's father's family, the Italian side.
She had an Italian father.
My grandfather grew up in New Jersey. My Jewish family are all from New York City. My grandfathers had 9 brothers and sisters and a house. They're growing grapes in the backyard, making wine during Depression. Like that's the era that my Italian grandfather came from. And he was a serious gardener, because he was the first member of his family to graduate high school. He moved to New York for work during the Depression, married a Jewish girl in New York, lived in apartments his whole adult life. And once my parents had a house, this Italian came out of him where he living there every free moment, gardening in our backyard. So we always had the tomatoes and the green peppers and all that sort of thing. But yes, honestly, Andrew, I was a young Republican. I was an arrogant little shit when I was 14, 15 years old. I was an elitist. I really thought that taxes were a form of poison and that the most capable people should achieve the highest levels of success. And it wasn't until I grew a little bit more mature that I developed a sense of empathy. And that's where my democratic instincts came
Do you
from.
think part of being a young Republican at 14 and 15 was a rebellion to your family, trying to be different?
I'm not sure. I think honestly, it was my own unchecked elitism. Like I was coddled and told how wonderful and brilliant I was. And that made me feel very special. And then special people deserve special treatment. And it's taken a lot over the years to come down off that mountain and realize, yes, I have tremendous privilege being a white man coming from at least a family of some comfort. But my role in life is to try to make the world better for everyone else.
Do you recall a specific experience where you felt a shift, or
It was probably the first time I took mushrooms.
the first time you took mushrooms is when you had a sense of empathy that you hadn't had before?
Yes.
What was that?
Freshman year of college, I was 18, 19 years old. And I saw sort of a foundational shift in the way I saw the interconnectedness of the world. And it was a life-changing moment. I was an arrogant, elitist little shit of a Republican teenager who was told by his mother how wonderful and handsome and brilliant he was from day one and believed it and internalized it and thought the world should revolve around me. And it doesn't. To the extent I do have like actual existing privilege because I am a relatively intelligent white person from means, I should use my powers for good, like fucking Spider-Man. So yeah, I had that realization. The visual of it and seeing how it all melds together and seeing the interconnection was just the beginning of a gradual process of, I'm not the most liberal person around here, but I do believe in the greater public good. I think the purpose of civilization is to try to improve the lot of all of us. That I see, honestly, we're heading towards a place where either there's going to be 12 billionaires and the rest of us are fighting over scrap heaps, or we're going to find a way to share the finite assets of this world in a way that everyone could live reasonably comfortably. I think the wealth is there. I think the resources is there, but it requires competent management and a lack of selfishness.
Did you go straight to college from high school? And
yes, I graduated
what
high
was your
school
plan?
In the 80s. The straight path was to go to college, the best college you went to. I went to the University of Pennsylvania, graduated in 4 years. And somewhere along the line, I got into the idea of city planning and urban development. So I worked my first job after college for county government in Trenton, New Jersey. While I was applying to graduate schools, after 2 years, I moved to Seattle. I got the University of Washington's Master of Urban Planning program and drove myself cross-country. I bought a tent and a sleeping bag and camped my way in a 5-week backroad road trip. It was the first time in my life I'd ever camped. I think I'm the first member of my family in 4 generations to own a sleeping bag.
So city planning, I'll say for the record, I believe you're my 4th city planner. I didn't even know what a city planner was, but I've had Vic Fisher, Jane Anvick, Anna Brawley, all have degrees in city planning.
I have to put in a plug for Vic. As I've worked as a professional in Alaska, really 3 older men I've looked to as mentors, as guideposts of what I want to do and potentially achieve with my life. Working from the oldest to youngest was Vic, and then Greg Erickson and Larry Pursley. I think they're 3 spectacular individuals.
I guess what intrigued you about city planning and what made you think was going to be your career?
The idea of working at scale of human civilization, of helping the parts fit together. But I got off path fairly quickly and got a little bit, I won't quite say disgruntled, but maybe disillusioned in my first job while I was still in Trenton, because planners do a lot of document writing and a lot of recommending, but they're 2 or 3 steps beyond. And I was watching how the political process worked, and the people that were close to the decision makers were able to be much more influential. And I realized somewhere along the line that even if this is the professional background I wanted, I probably wanted to work closer to the political process. And when I was applying to graduate schools, I faced a fork in the road. I seriously contemplated law school, and then I decided to go where I was originally intending, which was planning school.
So you went to planning school in Seattle,
University of Washington, yeah.
And then what happened?
So the first job I got was continuing along the same path. I worked for county government in Snohomish County. helping them implement a bunch of stuff related to the Growth Management Act. I learned a lot of obscure things about Washington state local government law.
What's something obscure about Washington state government law?
So Washington state counties, in New Jersey, there's no such thing as unincorporated. Everything's in a town. Within most of the western states, you have cities, and then you have the unincorporated Swiss cheese-shaped rest of the county. And the tax law, particularly in Washington, says the county can only tax countywide or throughout the entire unincorporated area. They don't have the ability to tax regions. So that creates a mosaic of special purpose districts all over Washington, fire districts, water districts, library districts, all that sort of thing, each with their own property taxing power. And it becomes a really complex mix, especially what was happening then. I hope you find it interesting, is that with the Washington Growth Management Act, the cities were supposed to create boundaries into the county that they were going to annex to, and the urban services were going to be limited to that, sewers, roads, sidewalks, all that kind of stuff, and try to get the county government into more of a rural role. And what that was going to do is erode the tax base of a lot of these special purpose districts. And I was helping them plan their own transition to when these annexations were going to take place.
So this sounds like Anchorage pre-unification, where you had the borough and the city and lots of questions about whose tax money was going where.
Yes.
So it'd be a very similar situation.
Alaska has gone, there's sort of a fork in the road among Alaskan larger municipalities. Anchorage and Juneau went the unified route. And then you see Fairbanks and Kenai and Matsu that have this unincorporated borough surrounding a bunch of cities. And there is some chaos and complexity around that stuff, including stuff like policing.
You worked in county government.
But most importantly, can I call you Andrew while we're on the podcast together?
Of course.
Importantly, Andrew, during the time I was in graduate school, I started coming to Alaska. A couple of my professors were, they would do sideline work, small consulting, waterfront plans, that kind of thing. For Alaskan communities, they had connections here. So there was a class trip my first year in graduate school where a bunch of us came up to Juneau and Haines for about a week and a half and then took the ferry back down, worked with the local group. And it was a wonderful experience. I loved it here. And while I was here, it sort of congealed in my mind that I wanted to do my thesis project here, which I'll talk about in a minute. The next year, that summer, which was 1991, the professors got a call from the city government. Does anyone from that group want to be an intern? So I raised my hand and I came up and I did an internship. In Juneau, for the community development group here in Juneau. Then I was planning my thesis. The next summer, I came up to do my thesis research, and which was about, really it was an economic analysis of suburbanization, to say what is the role of the federal government in subsidizing the suburbs, which was kind of my way of dealing with my teen angst over feeling like I was raised in a meaningless, formless bubble that didn't have any culture to it. Why does this even exist? Well, it exists because public policies were on purpose for class separation but a very infrastructure heavy, very road heavy, auto dominated world, because the federal government was paying for roads, because of mortgage interest tax deductions that were open ended, because of the way sewers was provided. And so I did a case study of Juneau, contrasting the Mendenhall Valley to the downtown, and came to the conclusion that approximately $6,000 per household per year worth of subsidy of one form or another went into suburban development. So that was, but Juneau was a nice little case study because it's a petri dish here. There's no roads in and out, so there's not a lot of externalities. So you could look at the economics of a suburb here, and the road isn't there because there's a highway continuing on to Cleveland, but just to connect it to the town or to the airport that's right there. It's sort of the way economists like to create simplified models. Juneau makes for a good simplified model because it's so bound like that.
A lot of variables are missing.
Exactly. It's 30,000 people, so it's not a small town, but it's rare to find in the world, except I suppose on an island, an isolated community that's as complete and intact as Juneau, with hospitals and airports and supermarkets and all of those things, but yet it doesn't connect through to any place else.
So you did your thesis.
I did my thesis.
Got
I
your
fell in love with
master's.
this town.
Yep.
And somewhere in that time period, I said, I love it here. I want to find a way to move back here. Fast forward a couple of years, I meet my wife, who's from Staten Island, New York, and another.
Did you meet her in Washington?
Yeah, we were both. She was an architecture student in the same school. I was in the graduate school was architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, and she came up for the summer and drove a tour bus for Princess. Now, my wife is entrepreneurial. She always wanted to run a business. I am not temperamentally that way. And in many ways, I'm her legislative staffer in that I'll do the paperwork and some of the banking and the organization and the document writing. And then she's the decision maker driving forward on the thing. So that's in my nature. So, but she came back from that summer saying, I want to start a business in Juneau. And we ended up buying a building here, an old building, which was called the Silver Bow Inn. It was a small hotel.
You bought this early on.
In 1997, we bought this. I was 31 years old. We did not know what we were doing. We had to beg, borrow, and steal funds from everyone that we knew. We converted that kitchen into a bagel bakery and a deli. I was out of the workforce for about 4 years. Well, I was working with my wife running a small business. The plan was always that I would go back to work once the business got on its feet, but she was always going to run the business. Over the years, we've done a couple of expansions. It's now a 16-room boutique hotel. She's become very successful, very good at the hotel business. Got a little bit done with the food business after a while. And 10 years ago, we were able to sell that. The bagel bakery was wonderful. It was fun and it's part of our identity. But it's much better to have a rent-paying restaurant tenant in your building than actually trying to do the day-to-day grind of running a restaurant. And I'll put in a plug for In Boca al Lupo here in Juneau, who are a fantastic tenant. They do amazing food, and they're great to work with.
Oh, yeah. My favorite restaurant in Juneau. My question is about deciding to do a bagel bakery. Did you hire somebody to be the bagel baker, or were you guys actually making bagels?
Jill had a desire to have a bagel bakery, and there were no traditional East Coast boiled bagels available in Alaska. There were a couple of shops in Anchorage, but they were more of a modern, steamed, mass-produced mechanism. It's not rocket science. It's not hard to learn how to do that. You just have to have the right equipment. I had a friend that I worked with in my first job in New Jersey. His name was Rick. The other young guy in the office. When we both left, I left to Seattle to go to graduate school. He left and opened a bagel bakery with his brother. And a few years later, he had another bagel bakery. And then he went through a divorce and he kind of needed to get out of Dodge and clear his head for a while. So it worked out very well that first summer we were open, he came to Alaska with his girlfriend then and helped us set up the bagel bakery. So he was the baker that first summer, taught me, taught Jill. From there, we were able to teach other people and go forward from there.
You said that you starting the bagel bakery was kind of part of your identity. And so but earlier when I asked if you grew up in a religious family, you said no, very secular, just happened to be Jewish. But I just assumed that you weren't like the Shabbat on Friday, turn all the
My wife does
electricity
come
off.
from a family more like
okay,
that.
so
She did have separate plates for milk and meat in the house.
so she grew up kosher.
And when she was dating a Gentile young man, when she was a little younger, her mother cut her off and wouldn't pay for school anymore. Like there were serious issues. You know, my family, my mother comes from a mixed marriage, but no, there was never that sort of pressure. We had a Christmas tree in the house.
So it's kind of an accident. Like you weren't necessarily looking for a Jewish wife, but she was looking for a Jewish husband after what had happened with the previous experience.
I think she always knew she would end up with a Jewish husband. I always assumed I would end up with a Jewish wife. I mean, if you're really getting personal, I was never I had serious girlfriends. I was more of a serial monogamist. I didn't date a lot. I didn't, have flings or anything like that. And pretty much every other girlfriend was Jewish. I sort of zigged and zagged back and forth as I got closer to whatever it was I was eventually looking for. I always considered myself culturally Jewish. I was bar mitzvahed, but we didn't follow a lot of the complex religious observances. And my mother's father's family, the Italian side of my family, she had 1 million cousins. He came from a large family, of course, and she really liked Christmas as a child, where they would go to visit all of her cousins' houses, and they would go from house to house to house. So she made it her business to do a weird Jewish Christmas, where she would cook all this Italian food, lasagna and stuffed shells and veal, but it would be 25 Jewish people in our house, and there'd be a tree, but Jesus wasn't present, but the sort of American secular holiday of Christmas was present. And that was just normal childhood to me. I didn't know it was weird.
What did you guys do with your kids?
Oh, they're very much Jewish. Like we
Oh, because you started the temple here.
Well, Juneau's had a Jewish community active for 100 years. I mean, there's buildings named for old mayors named Goldstein here in Juneau, but we met in churches, we met in people's homes, and this is from the early 1900s clear until the early 2000s. A building came available from the city and borough that had a nonprofit had left behind, and they were dispensing with it, and there was a sealed bid, and the community came together. We had an older member of the community with a standing offer of a large donation if we could ever get a building together, and that was sort of on the table. We all pitched in. We all reached out to our parents who were elderly at this point. I'm talking a few dozen members of the community. So we cobbled together a few $100,000, bought a building, renovated it, and Congregation Sukkot Shalom opened in Juneau in 2005 or so. And yeah, I was on the board back then, and we've been involved in that community. My son was bar mitzvahed there.
Yeah. Back to the Silver Bow. So I guess like I'm looking for like, what was your job? Like, was your job just running the business or?
So for the first 3 or 4 years, Jill and I ran the business together, and it was a small business intensity. And of course, the construction.
It was a hotel then too?
That first, yes. The building many years ago had apartments upstairs, like a lot of urban commercial buildings. That got converted by the owners before us. It had been a family bakery for 4 generations. It's the oldest bakery in Alaska. It had been there since 1902. You know, it's funny. It was a family business selling bread for 75 years. Then that business model sort of died because of imported stuff from the barge and shelf life and so on. And then suddenly fresh made bread became artisanal, and that's where we came into it. We were making probably a very similar product to what our predecessors were 100 years earlier. So yes, I did bake in the early years. By no means am I a trained baker, but I'm a decent baker and I enjoy it. I would also do in the early years the handyman work and then all the books and what I called large organization relations, the bureaucracy stuff, while Jill ran day-to-day operations, personnel ordering, all that stuff.
So I guess at some point you started doing other work besides the bagel business.
Right. I mean, here I am with this master's degree and analytic minds, and then we're going to start having kids, right? So I wanted something with insurance. So yeah, I took a job with the state in 2002. I was at the Department of Fish and Game. Tony Knowles was still governor. It was the very tail end of his administration. And it was a planner position attached to the commissioner's office dealing with a bunch of federal funding and grants and that sort of thing. And it wasn't a terribly fascinating job, but it was an entree into the system. When Murkowski came in, he used that funding source to try to revitalize the salmon industry. And that was actually something meaningful that I got to be a part of. Lots of grant money went out towards pinball machines and refrigeration upgrades for small fishing boats and grants to local communities. Salmon was struggling then against the onslaught of the growing farmed fish world. And we helped upgrade Alaska's industry to compete and also brand what we do here as inherently superior, wild and natural. That message wasn't quite out yet. And real important work was done in that time period that I was quite proud of. And from that place, and my hotel is just 2 blocks from the Capitol building. And I've always been very close to the environment around here. I had friends who worked here. I knew legislators. They would stay in my place. So eventually I reached out and sought the opportunity, was given the opportunity to start working in the Capitol. My first job was for Eric Croft in 2006.
Okay. So you went to work for Eric Croft in 2006. And what led to that position and why that legislator? How did that happen?
I've been sniffing around for a while. I've been wanting to do this. I liked the idea of the life. I thought it would be exciting. It turned out I'd really liked it. This is 20 years ago now. The summer before that was the year they messed up the pension system, which was special sessions. And special sessions, legislator housing, it gets complicated. And Eric lived in my hotel for a couple of weeks that summer, and we got to know each other a little bit better. And then he ended up with a vacancy. What happened was Eric was running for governor, and he got off the finance committee because the finance committee is a lot of work, particularly in the spring months later in session. And he wanted a little bit more flexibility where he could travel and work on the weekends and campaign and start working on knocking doors and getting to know people around the state. So he got off the finance committee. A long-term aide of his who thought of herself as, I'm a finance aide, and that's sort of an elite status within the legislative staff community, moved on to want to work for another finance member. And so he called me up and said, hey, Ken, you want to give this a shot? I said, yes, I would love to. And it was very much a perfect career moment opportunity for me. What was going on that year was Eric and Ethan Berkowitz were both in the minority. They were both sort of the two smart, relatively young guys. Ethan was the leader. Eric was their lead guy on finance, and that had been their roles. But they were both running for governor against a perceived very weak incumbent, Frank Murkowski. No one understood the Sarah Palin thing yet, that early that year. So Ethan controlled the institutional powers of the minority as the leader, and Eric was sort of on his own with Harry Crawford, who was his best friend in the legislature. And then we got into this endless series of special sessions on oil taxes and the Stranded Gas Act pipeline. And I had been working on oil and gas issues through the regular session. And now all of a sudden, I was the only guy here with a model and the ability to unwind all this stuff. And I became the resource, the go-to guy on sort of working on these oil and gas issues for then the entirety of the minority. And other people started talking to me. Before I knew it, a year or two later, I'm a real life subject matter expert. Sarah Palin is the governor, and we're working with Pat Galvin, Representative Galvin's husband, who's the Commissioner of Revenue. We're passing this very progressive, using the literal word that was in the bill, progressivity oil tax system that we were able to pay back billions of dollars to the constitutional budget reserve, set aside billions in savings.
Right. You went from like $4 billion to $18 billion during Pat Galvin's tenure
in the
CBR.
Now, we passed a bill that had this escalating rate that happened as profitability increased. And that fall, it was 2007, oil was hitting kind of the 70s for the first time ever. And the modeling was showing these really generous numbers. It's like, wow. But it also showed the extraordinary returns on investment because the way that tax slid up when profitability increased, it also slid down when reinvestment occurred aggressively because profitability is decreasing. It's the same marginal tax rate in both directions. So we passed it, and then within a couple of months, oil is suddenly $110, $120 a barrel, which was really outside what anyone was even conjecturing at the time. And the revenue was rolling in at close to $1 billion a month. So we had this couple of year period. I remember the special session a summer later where there was a single appropriation of $4.2 billion of surplus towards the payback of past owed loans from the Constitutional Budget Reserve. 10 years worth of budget balancing draws happened in a single transaction in a special session. It was just shocking. And then the money kept coming. And it was Alaska's fair share. It was not onerous. It was not theft from the industry, despite what they'll think. It got to the point where the marginal rates were a little bit high. It was definitely a level of ratcheting back that needed to happen, but it wasn't extreme. And then my role in those later years, I call myself the free safety for ACES. Like we in the minority were trying to prevent all these efforts year after year after year to try to unwind the oil tax and drag it back to something that was more industry friendly, that the Republican majorities were more supportive of. And part of what was helping, of course, was the bipartisan Senate of that era, the Johnny Ellis-led bipartisan Senate.
With Lina Green.
Yes, exactly. And it was after the 2012 election, which was a redistricting election, that you suddenly went back to having the partisan majorities on both sides. And everyone knew that 2013 was going to be the year that it all happened. And I was working for Beth Kratula, who was the minority leader at the time for several years, as sort of the caucus oil and gas specialist. It was a great time, a great job. We did a lot of fun things. But 2013 emotionally broke Beth Kratula.
So you worked for Croft and then Harry Crawford and then Beth Kratula?
There were a couple others along the way. I've worked for 12 different legislators in 17 sessions. And in fact, 6 of them, including Andy Josephson, where I am right now, were in their last term when I worked for them. I don't know if I'm the kid.
So you specialize in retiring legislators.
I guess I specialize, or I stick around with them until they retire. But yes, it has sort of worked out that way. After Eric, I worked for Mike Dugan, who replaced him in the Spenard seat. And then I worked briefly for Andrea Dahl here in Juneau, and then Harry for close to 3 years, and then Beth for 3 years. Now, Beth left to go to work in the Obama administration in the middle of her last term in 2014 and was replaced by Sam Keto III. So I survived with Keto, but he was a minority junior member, so he didn't have a lot of interim staff. So I was going to lose my job then. And it was Click Bishop, who I love to this day, who I'd always been friends with and I talked to. And he considered me part of his brain trust, I guess, talking about issues. They brought me on for the interim of 2014. And it was in that role. And maybe that was sort of like a ritual purification. I was working for a real live Republican, and therefore I wasn't a ghettoized, poisoned Democrat staffer, that when the bipartisan Walker administration came in, that I was a viable candidate. And they named me tax director at the end of 2014. And I got to take that job in the Department of Revenue.
I want to talk about being tax director during the Walker administration. I wanted to just finish my question from before when you said that you weren't, I forget the words you used exactly.
The most liberal guy.
The most liberal guy. And I pointed out that on some issues, I'm pretty conservative. I guess, what are some things that would make somebody the most liberal guy? And
I don't believe in public ownership of the means of production. I understand the role of the profit motive. I am a legitimate small business person, although my wife actually runs it. I know that it's important to have efficiency. I know that there are certain things government inherently just doesn't do well because there isn't the sort of profit motive. I'll say that some of the weakest links in governance are not necessarily in the wastefulness of public employees, but in the wastefulness of public contracting and weak cost controls and corporations that predate on government on those weak cost controls and take advantage of them. But still, they deserve to make money. They deserve a reasonable return on investment. And Alaska's economy is, and it's a dirty word to some people, but it's a colonial economy. Since the time of Western contact, since the first Russians shot the first seal in 1740, Alaskans' economic development has been about someone with outside capital, larger than the people that actually live here, investing money, expecting a return on that investment to extract resources and leave behind as little as they could for the people that are here, and the tension of that against the people that actually live here and want to build a permanent economy with it. That's what I'm here for, to help represent the people that live here, to build a permanent economy and a fair division. And that's a subject to debate, and that's what the political process is for. People will disagree, but there are people who take a maximalist position on both sides, and I am not with either of those positions. I think numbers and facts and past history and precedent are important, and we need to have an honest conversation. And that's why some of these, when it gets emotional, and interestingly, it's emotional on the industry side. If you don't take our position, you're against the gas line. You're trying to drive away investment. You're gonna harm the people. It's like, no, we're talking really about the margins here. We're talking about the last 5 or 10% of dividing up a very large thing. And I think we deserve honest information and honest representation.
Back to being tax director under Walker.
Yes, wonderful man.
Did you feel qualified and ready for that job?
So the tax division is a major agency within the Department of Revenue. There are 25 different taxes in there. It was created during the Knowles administration by the merger of two smaller tax agencies, one focused on oil and one focused on everything else, as part of a government efficiency program of the time. Typically, the director has been an oil-oriented person and the deputy director has been the everything-else-oriented person. So I came in there with legitimate subject matter expertise on oil taxes and was able to step into that role and be also something of a policy vector of the administration and help develop legislation, tax credit reform, and all that sort of thing. And then while doing that, I didn't know much about fish taxes and cigarette taxes and corporate income taxes, but I was able to learn that with a very competent deputy director and a very capable staff. And I'm a curious guy. And there was about 110 people, about 2/3 of them in Anchorage and 1/3 of them in Juneau. I'd be back and forth all the time. And within a matter of months, I was pretty up to speed on everything the agency did. Yeah, I felt very qualified.
Did you have particular accomplishments that you're proud of during that time?
Internal and external both, Andrew. Yes. I mean, internally, we were there during an era of severe cutbacks because of budgetary constraints. We lost 22 positions out of my 120 I started with 98 when I left, something like that. And that is heartbreaking. We didn't fire anybody. It's all about vacancies and moving positions around, and every budget cycle has a few less. Making the organization work doing that. Switching over to all electronic filing, which means 40 boxes of paper doesn't show up every October when corporate income taxes are due. Those kinds of things were important. And we were doing legitimate cutbacks when other agencies were pretending and moving money around and changing their billable rates back to the Department of Administration or something like that. We were actually creating efficiency. But no, the real accomplishments were when we came in, we had a very generous system of cashable oil tax credits that were part and parcel of the very aggressive oil tax collection system that a big portion of it was going back to encourage the new guy, the next field, the explorer, and that sort of thing. But when the prices fell and the revenue fell off the table and the credits were still there, we were left with an overhang of close to $1 billion owed and a lot more pending in years to come if we couldn't fix it. Along with others in the administration, we developed, and I carried these two major bills through the legislature in 2016 and 2017 that unwound Alaska from the cashable tax credit system. And I think that was, yes, the most important bills passed in the Walker administration were, of course, the percent of market value and the Medicaid expansion implementation and having to set up a marijuana tax, which I had a role in too. That was sort of fun. And that's a whole side story. That could be a podcast in itself, building the cash deposit room in Anchorage and all that. But those two tax credit bills are, to me, a significant career accomplishment of mine that I'm very proud of having been a part of and being able to carry through this body.
So is it literally a cash deposit room in Anchorage?
In the parking garage across the street from the Atwood building, there is an office that belongs to the Department of Revenue that is also used for if you've got a child support issue or a PFD protest, you could apply for your dividends there. So it's various agencies of the Department of Revenue. And we set up in there a hardened room with safes and cameras and all of this where the marijuana taxpayers could bring their cash, because it's all a cash business, and drop it in the slot. And then our tax techs would open those safes, two of them at the time with all sorts of protocols so no one knows all the passwords, and count it and bundle it and put a state deposit slip on it. And now it's no longer the proceeds of a drug transaction as far as the federal government's concerned. It's simply state tax revenue, and we would be able to deposit it into the bank. We were laundering it on behalf of the marijuana industry. Yeah, we set that up. And we did it for about 10% of the price that they did when they set up a similar system in Oregon a couple of years earlier. And I was very proud of that.
If Walker had been reelected, you would have stayed in the administration?
I would have stayed in the administration. And of course, he dropped out towards the tail end of the race. And I threw my support to Mark Begich. But in the end, it was sort of a doomed operation by the end. And Dunleavy got elected. And we all, the exempt employees, had to write the formulaic resignation letter that said, I didn't expect to be kept on realistically. I was in many ways the face of Bill Walker's tax agenda with a new conservative governor coming in, and my resignation was accepted, and I was let go on noon of Inauguration Day. I was the only person in the entire Department of Revenue who was let go. I took that as a little bit of a badge of honor, but that's okay. And then I came back here to the legislature.
Who'd you go to work for right after you left the Walker administration?
Well, there's about a 6-week gap between when a new governor comes in and when a new legislature gets sworn in. So I was in a little bit of a quandary, and I actually asked the Dunleavy people in my letter, if you keep me on for a few weeks, I could bring the new person up to speed. I could do a lot of things, and that way I don't have to worry about a gap in what I'm going to do. I'm probably going to go back to the legislature. Tuckerman Babcock had no interest in that, obviously, and I was let go.
So you were let go like immediately at noon?
Yeah, I got an email at 8:30 in the morning on Inauguration Day. My resignation is accepted effective noon today. Please turn on your keys and your state cell phone and all the things that come with an executive position. No, it's just fine. Paul Seaton had been unelected by your friend Sarah Vance, who I also like very much. And he was a lame duck representative at that point, and he had room in his payroll, and we were friends. And he wanted to kind of talk about stuff and kind of pick my mind about policy because he's a deeply engaged, very smart guy. So I worked for Paul Seaton.
That's so interesting. So you went on to Paul Seaton's payroll after he was unelected and basically was just waiting for the new legislator to be sworn in. Yeah. So it's not exactly a busy time in the legislator's life.
And honestly, or in a staffer's life. And we all work crazy hours for 4 months, and it's a lot more casual the rest of the year. It's a lifestyle choice. It works for certain people. It's worked really well for me with my family over the years. But the first real job I had was for Dan Ortez. And I just spent that first session with him, and he was on finance and just sort of getting back into the swing of it. So these last 8 years I've been here. It's been fun. And of course, my friends have sometimes been in the majority. Sometimes they haven't. I was with Chris Tuck at LB&A for a moment. Adam Lowell is a good friend of mine, and I was with him his last term. That was right before you got elected, I guess, right? Adam's a wonderful character. And the joke at the time, because he and Andy, my current boss, and Ortez were all in finance, and they were the Bald Caucus, and I was the chief of staff to the Bald Caucus because I qualify for the title. Right? And they were kind of the liberal wing within the other majority members of the Finance Committee. I spent 2 years in Senate Finance working for Senator Donnie Olson, carrying bills over there. That was a fun job. It's a very different culture working in the Senate. Just the nature of the relationship between the members and the staff, it's much more streamlined. They don't debate as much. I mean, you watch them, and it's amazing. They could pass 6 bills while you guys are still on Amendment 1. And I didn't find that I fit in very well over there. It wasn't really a good match for me. And then these last 2 years, I've been with Andy, who, again, another legislator about to retire, so which seems to be my specialty.
So I had Brian Fector on the podcast earlier this year. He was the
Deputy Commissioner of Revenue at one point, and he
2021 to 23.
So Brian wrote an amazing document. He was some sort of policy assistant for Pat Pitney when she was the OMB director of the Walker administration. That's where I first came to know him. It was a great document that sort of deconstructed this myth that somehow Alaska has the biggest per capita government in the country, that therefore we must be wasteful and profligate or what have you. Once you start breaking apart what's going on here, not just the higher cost of living, but the PFD is its own standalone thing. There isn't any local government in huge parts of the state. We're running courthouses everywhere. The state operates 240 airports. There's things that there's simply no corollary for anywhere else in the country. And once you back out those things, we're about medium average, a little high among the other states in the country. So Brian did that. I wish it got wider play, but it was a very important analysis. And yeah, Brian survived into this administration at Revenue. He was their admin services guy for a while. And then I think he ran afoul of Adam Crum when he came in as commissioner in the second half of the administration.
He did. What's interesting, he wrote an article that appeared in the Landmine earlier this year. I had him on immediately after that appeared. It was called something like Alaska legislators can learn a lot from Washington and Idaho, because he went to work for Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, immediately upon leaving here. And then he's worked at a university in Idaho, but deals with their sort of legislative interaction. And so he had a lot of suggestions about things that he thinks that Washington and Idaho do better than Alaska. And so I know that you haven't worked with any other legislatures, but I guess I'm curious if you'd be open to some of his suggestions. I think one of the suggestions I've actually said on the floor, which is that our finance committee sees bills with relatively small fiscal notes, and other states, at least Washington and Idaho, would not be sending bills that have less than $100,000 fiscal notes to their finance committee.
Honestly, it's bigger than that. And I'm probably speaking out of turn because I work for the finance committee. But in the Alaska legislature, the finance committee takes upon itself almost a super legislature within the legislature role, that they get last touch on any significant bill, because any bill at all is going to have a fiscal note, whether it's raising revenue or spending money. Most any significant piece of legislation is going to do something. And then it always goes to finance, and it always goes to finance last. So you as chair of judiciary or a health committee or a state affairs committee will work weeks working out complex policy. And in my opinion, too often a finance committee will take it upon themselves to second guess that and undo it and put their own policy preferences on it, and not just limit their touch to the budgetary aspects. And it creates really a pecking order of elitism within the finance committees that I don't think is healthy for the process.
There was an idea, I believe it's Idaho, that has a joint finance committee from both bodies. So basically, and I love this idea of having a joint committee that prepares the budget. So you're not sort of trading an operating budget back and forth, a capital budget back and forth, but doing them almost like a conference committee in real time from the beginning.
It's not a horrible idea. Some of the cultural norms around here are just so embedded for decades, and no one even remembers why. Why does the operating budget always start in the House? And then the House, who's more deliberative to begin with and argues all these amendments, and the Senate's just watching. They know where all the House's pressure points and weak points and conflict points are. Then they take the budget, and then they can manipulate it to take out everything that's important to prominent House members as a bargaining chip towards that conference committee. They're very, very strategic in how they deal with the budget process. And the House is more freeform and transparent. Probably every other year, at least, it should start in the Senate and then the House would get it second. That would be a fair way to do it. There's just, no one ever says why. It's not like in the U.S. Constitution where revenue measures must originate in the House or something like that. It's just because that's the way it's always done. There's also a generational transition happening in the Senate right now, too, where for the last decade, there's been a lot more experience, just many long-tenured senators. And most of them are retiring in this cycle. So I'm curious how when the next legislature comes in, if there's a little bit of a different dynamic between the bodies.
If you had a magic wand and could change some things about the way the Alaska legislature works, what would you do?
I definitely agree that the Finance Committee shouldn't have such an outsized role in making the rest of the policy.
Because it's like an everything committee.
It's become an everything committee. And when we have occasionally a special committee on Ways and Means, it's looking at tax measures, but it's not looking at them to pass them. It's looking at them to maybe vet them and get some information on the record and then send it on to the Finance Committee, who are then going to do it. And I see the strain within the Finance Committee when the budget's complicated and there's major legislation and there's different chairmen handling both. How do they divide up the time and how do they conflict with each other? Because I need next Wednesday morning, but I need next Wednesday morning. And possibly having a Ways and Means committee or some sort of budget committee that was separate from a spending policy committee like bills, it might be worthy to have that in two different committees and then not having them overseeing each other. Spread the wealth and spread the workload a little bit, because finance gets exhausting too. In the last weeks of session, they're doing 2-a-day hearings. They're here off until 10, 11 o'clock at night. And many of the standing committees start shutting down because they know that there's no time, because whatever they produce has to then go to the Finance Committee. And it's got to be frustrating for you as a non-finance chairman to see how it gets short-circuited like that.
So I'm going to ask a delicate question. It's my understanding that there's a 2-tiered staff system in the building, and there's a lot of resentment from folks who are not finance staff or not staff for leadership, because leadership and finance members are able to offer so many more range points to their staff that you end up in a situation where folks who in some offices might be doing less and getting paid substantially more. And I will just say that in my office, my staff does a lot of work. I have a very active committee and I have a lot of legislation. And so in this particular office, I don't think I'd be shocked if there were folks working that much harder.
There is more work that needs to be done in a majority office if you have a committee versus a minority office. But I worked at low ranges minority offices for many, many years and worked very hard, and we tried to be very effective. You also happen to be a competent personnel manager. There are 60 individuals here that each are in their own way the king of a small kingdom or queen, and there's tremendous deference to them by the administrative side of the legislature that handles personnel and accounting and all of that. You guys could pretty much do whatever you want. And some legislators are not very good managers. They're simply not. They might be very effective legislators. They might be brilliant, but that doesn't mean that they're good at keeping their people doing things. Now, as far as yes, leadership staff is an elite within, and it's sort of like a secret society almost. And I'm half into it. I've always been a little bit of an outsider within the community, and I don't know exactly why. I'm just a little bit off-putting to people, and people think here I am doing your podcast. I'm not staying in my lane. Staff are supposed to be seen and not heard to a degree. I'm not trying to make public policy. I'm trying to make my boss as effective as I can, but I have opinions and I'll share them. And if people want to hear what I have to say, then maybe they'll run with that.
Okay, I'm going to quote a previous podcast guest, former Senator Liesl McGuire.
Wonderful person.
Who said that in her opinion, the first 4 years of being a legislator are really learning how to do the job. The second 4 years of being a legislator are your most productive period. And whatever comes after is a long decline.
There's a senator retiring who's been here for 40 years, and he seems pretty effective to me. So I'm not quite sure that that's universally true, but there's an energy you bring to it. There's a commitment and a number of hours that probably does start to taper off after a while. And there definitely is a learning curve.
And just for the record, I paraphrased her. It's not exactly how she said it. To be more clear and accurate, she said that it's possible at a certain point, once you've been in the building long enough, that it's no longer about making certain legislation happen, but it really is more about hanging onto the job and wielding power and like being the puppet master inside the building. And there is a disconnect between, am I doing things that actually help the average person, in my community?
Certain positions come through seniority. And you see that, once you're on the finance committee, generally speaking, you stay on the finance committee, for example, and that's always seen as a real plum. The puppet master is a skill set, the ability to see several steps ahead. There's a strategic brilliance that certain people have that other people don't. A good rule chairman has that skill because it's not just being a traffic cop, but figuring out in what order to bring things and what might be a vehicle for something else and what might be a trade for something else, because it is a political process and there's no corruption in that. It's collaborative, and you have individual self-interests working with each other in a complex, fast-paced, but high stakes. There's real money and real people's lives on the line here. And legislators are blindsided by that. I often see particularly new conservative legislators who are coming from districts that are predisposed to think government's too big and it's also wasteful and it's all just a swamp. And you get to Juneau and they suddenly start realizing all of the many things that state government does and how important it is on a million micro levels in every single person's life, including conservative people in rural districts. And Alaskans, by and large, have needs other than snow plowing and decent schools. It's like there's a lot. But once they start recognizing that, and once they start voicing that or voting on budgetary measures that help, they get accused of having sold out and become part of the swamp and become a rhino. And then the constituents want to get rid of them. And really, one of the best things that I've seen happen is ranked choice voting. And I'm a huge proponent. And I think it filters out the excesses of both sides, that it really does tend to bring more collaborative, moderate people together.
So 20 years in the building, I imagine that there are a couple of stories that are the ones that are the most memorable, like your, I don't know, craziest days in the Capitol. Can you share?
I wish I had been asked that in advance and I would have thought about it to prepare.
Hey, but you know what? We can always do it at the next break.
That's very funny, right? I don't know that your listeners are aware that we're sitting here on Sine Die Day.
Yeah,
the very last
final day of the
final
session.
Day of the session. It's a crazy day. There's a million things happening in a million directions. You're going in and out of the floor. Caucuses are happening. House is watching the Senate. Senate's watching the House. It's currently 8:00 at night. In 4 hours, no matter what, you have to be done. And by the way, a special session on the gas line
starting tomorrow.
Starts tomorrow morning.
And I'm just sharing this because it's true. I'm literally having chest pain, and I'm like telling myself a story that this is heartburn, this is, anxiety because of the day. But there is part of me that's like trying to just like reassure myself that I'm not having a heart attack. But I mean, like, that's the moment in the session that we're at.
And for me, I was, for my first 10 years here, the oil and gas guy. And then I was the tax guy, in addition to the oil and gas guy over there. The last 8 years, not so much. There hasn't been major resource legislation moving. But now suddenly this big issue has been dropped upon us. And I'm one of the handful of people here with not just the institutional memory that it existed, but remembering actively working on these bills and what the issues were on the bills in the past. And what we're witnessing, frankly, with this Glen Farm deal is a follow-on effect of a very aggressively protective bill creating the Alaskan Gasline Development Corporation and giving them what at the time we called superpowers. Tremendous confidentiality, lack of oversight from other state functions. And that was written by certain legislators at the time with the belief that it was necessary to advance the specific project that was pending at the time. And then they would be the state's agent in that. That project did not happen and the powers remained. And now we have a contract where you are being asked to give large tax concessions and make long-term commitments without having access to any of the underlying information about what is the deal that this state agency, state created and funded agency, has made with a new company that none of us knew anything about a year and a half ago that could potentially build a $50-70 billion piece of infrastructure that will change our economy for generations or not. What are the terms of that deal? And what are the economics of this? Because they're asking for hundreds of millions of dollars in tax concessions, and they want it now, or else they're going to blame you for killing the gas line. And that's just unfair.
When we had the long day on the floor,
Monday,
day
before yesterday.
Yeah.
Representative, yeah.
A very long day on the floor, taking up amendments, having to deal with the gas line. And we've talked about this already. I don't serve on finance. I don't serve on resources. I'm chair of House Judiciary. I'm co-chair of the Joint Armed Services Committee. I serve on the Health and Social Services Committee. None of that is gas line. And so I've gone to the all legislator meetings. I've watched presentations. I've met with Glen Farn executives. But ultimately, this is not really my wheelhouse. And one of the skills I think that you have to have as a legislator is you have to know that you can only be an expert on so many things. I'm not going to be an expert on this. Like I have to accept that. I have to trust my colleagues, and I have to know enough to understand the basics of what's happening around me.
I will say there are tremendous legal issues in this that in many ways judiciary should be looking at. And I'm going to say in a minute what the main one is. And I'll say the ACES bill, the big tax bill of 2007, went to 3 committees in each body. In the Senate, it went to Judiciary, which was chaired by Hollis French, who is a great attorney. And
an amazing podcast guest.
I'm sure he is. I haven't listened to his yet. But they took a very close look at a lot of the legal underpinnings of oil taxes and had a material impact on the final version of that bill. This bill, and as it was being debated on the floor on Monday, had provisions that were developed in the Senate to unwind some of the so-called superpowers of the AGDC to whatever goes forward. There won't be as much confidentiality. There'll be some legislative sharing. Certain things can be published. Certain future activities require legislative approval. They don't have blanket protection from the Open Meetings Act and the Procurement Code and those kind of things. And then I sat there and watched an amendment passed by a member of the House that systematically unwound and gutted all of those confidentiality protections that the sponsor, Representative Kopp, put in his amendment that was trying to get this big deal through. And it passed by a thin majority. And now all of a sudden those protections are gone from the bill. And I think the admission that that was a need exposes the idea that if this project fails, we need to make sure whatever we do pass doesn't bind future legislators to those decisions, that you'll have the ability to reopen and readdress and make sure that the legislation of the day matches the project of the day if this project doesn't work out.
Right, which would be like a sunset on these statutes that we're passing.
That if it doesn't work out and 5 years from now someone else comes in and says, I want to get a gas line built, they're not automatically stepping into whatever structure you're building for Glen Farm today.
Well, again, my non-expert view on the floor, what I was seeing in real time was when an amendment was going to place more risk on the company, we were told that we should be voting no. But when there was an amendment that would place more risk on the Alaskan people, we were supposed to vote yes. That was the message of the room, because you help the company because you want this project to go forward. If you're helping the Alaskan people, then you're an impediment to the project. And I'm speaking very generally. I'm making a very overarching statement about the feel of the Monday floor session. But that's how it felt to me.
One can poke holes with that, but what you're saying is broadly true. And that's often true of these big industry, V-state, oil tax and gas pipeline legislation are of the same niche category. And I've been intimately close to a dozen or more of them over the years. And to your earlier question, probably the most exhilarating days for me in my career have been days like last Monday, where I've been in the thick of a big, complex debate and helping our members trying to shape a major piece of research legislation with multi-billion-dollar potential and context around it. I don't like the idea that we are supposed to sacrifice to make something happen. This isn't a jobs program. I mean, that's the shortest version of it. Yes, a pipeline project would be great. It would employ thousands of people. All this activity will occur, but it's going to put costs on communities. It's going to change the nature of the state, and it's going to remove a non-renewable resource for good that we've had up there for all these years. We've been producing oil close to 50 years on the North Slope now. The gas is still there. Eventually, that gas is going to get developed. When it is, we, the Alaska people, deserve a fair return on it. What is exactly a fair return? It's $800 million. They say, not necessarily, because the bill also has a provision where we're supposed to give a piece of that on to municipalities. That was a brand new provision none of us had seen until that amendment was introduced. And 10 years ago, when we were talking about the same project, it was $2.5–3 billion dangled before us. And none of that's real until it actually happens. And by happens, it's not just the pipeline to get gas to Anchorage, which is important for long-term security of our largest city, but the big export project, the LNG facility, which might cost $30 billion, and all the ships and the docks and the infrastructure around all of that. And maybe, just maybe, that'll make a few $100 million for the state. But the gas tax structure that's in place now that passed for another project in 2014 is odd and doesn't really work for things now. It worked for a project where we were going to own 25% of it, and we were going to take all of the gas so-called in kind, and basically the state was going to be our own shipper and marketer of gas. We are not going to in this operation, but yet our tax system is built around the assumption that we are. These are things that really need to get talked about and shouldn't get shoved down your throat. This bill was talked about vaguely last November, December, and not put on the table until day 60, halfway through the legislative session. And then you're told if you don't pass it, it's your fault somehow. That's simply not fair.
Well, we were set up. I think Jeff Lanfield was doing social media posts about they're going to do it live. And it did feel like that we were going on the floor with an incomplete bill that we were somehow going to debate and put it into a complete and functional, meaningful. We were going to make some sort of meaningful piece of legislation all together on the floor. I think maybe it was even Kevin McCabe described it that we are in a caucus of the whole and we are writing a bill.
Right, like a 40-person finance committee.
Yeah.
I mean, I have tremendous respect for Representative Kopp, who spearheaded this process. And I know that he really wants this to happen. And, saying the quiet part out loud, that this was part of the thing to get the pension bill, which is his passion and his dream, and he deserves, and the Alaskan employees deserve. I'm a 60-year-old Tier 3 state employee who's now eligible for retirement. And that's unfair that all of the younger people and very smart, capable people I work with who will not have those opportunities. So I supported the attempt to get that. But you drop a bill this big in another bill in the House. I mean, first off, you're going to set off a flurry because everyone's got an idea. I mean, 36 amendments to an amendment is unprecedented. I'd never seen that before. And even if it worked out, and there were a dozen stumbling blocks, and what blew it up was probably the fourth or fifth stumbling block. So good try. It didn't work out. The last one was the Senate really going to concur with that? Because even if they like the policy, as a cultural institution, the Alaska State Senate does not like being told what to do. They are the senior body. They are the voice of, just like the U.S. Senate. They are the saucer that cools the teacup that is the House and all of that. This bill concept that the Committee of the Whole was debating has not been heard in either Finance Committee. It didn't originate in the Senate. None of them really knew what was in it. They're watching television and learning as you're doing it live. And then literally within hours, not days, but hours, because of a midnight deadline on a veto threat, they would have been expected to concur with this thing. I have a hard time imagining the perfect storm of events that would have enabled that to happen, but I was prepared to help.
Right. Well, there was one theory by a senator that said, vote yes on everything, no matter how crazy it is, just vote yes on everything. Give the governor absolutely everything that he's asking for, no matter how crazy it is. Get pensions through. It doesn't matter because this project, even if we sign our lives away. It's not going to happen. And this senator firmly believed that. He was like, just vote yes on everything. Just give it to everything. It still won't happen, which I think would be like sort of the ultimate, I guess, pessimist. But
sure, but maybe. And there's a lot of reasons to think this project isn't real, especially knowing how much we don't know. But what if it doesn't? And then what I would say casually, it's like, I'd pass a flaming turd to get a pension bill. And I think that was what that, paraphrasing what that same senator said. And I don't know which senator it was. However, the flaming turd has to have guardrails. And the guardrails are the protection against that system being in place long-term. Because it is hard to pass these bills. It is, especially a bill to give something to a big industry is hard enough. A bill to take something from them, because then they and all of their strength and wealth and lobbyists get mobilized against the change to protect this thing that they had previously been given. It is very hard to take something back from industry. So it needs to self-sunset. The issues that I was working on Monday were mostly about that, the failure protection. Great, but what happens if it doesn't work?
So I think in summary, and I've done a really bad job of speaking about this on the floor, but in part, in my defense, because I'm literally thinking out loud on the floor.
You're among the least filtered legislators, and that's something I really
thank you. But I mean, but here's the deal. If you're very unfiltered and are willing to think out loud on the floor, you're not going to hit all home runs. You're going to stand up and say some pretty stupid shit every now and then. But what I've been trying to say and not been able to articulate very well is these very conservative legislators who are standing up and saying, we have to be friendly to this industry because they are doing something that no one else has been willing to do. You have to understand just how difficult it is for them to do what they're going to do. And we need to bend over backwards for them because we're so lucky to have this. You talked at the very beginning about colonial state, a resource extraction state. It's literally like we're begging somebody to come and take our natural resource from us. And, please come and take it. Please go out and sell it for enormous amount of profit for yourself. And we'll say thank you. And I'm like, but if this were...
And give me a nice bowl of soup for dinner.
And that same very conservative legislator, if this was their property, if they were making a business deal for themselves, they would absolutely, in my heart, I believe they would absolutely be negotiating for the last possible penny that they could get in return for their resource being taken from them and sold by somebody else for a profit. I mean, they would just absolutely not do this with their own property. And I don't know why they don't understand that this is all of our property and we should be negotiating like we would do for ourselves on behalf of the state. And I haven't figured out how to articulate that in a way that people understand.
Okay. I'm going to say something that I'm probably going to regret. And within the 19th century indigenous American community, a slur, the people that were mocked internally by the people, they were called the hang around the forts, the people who identified with the colonizer and the oppressor.
Uncle Tom.
The Uncle Tom, right, which is an African-American term. In a colonial relationship, there's a certain type of person who starts to believe that's what's in the outside capital's interest is what is in my best interest. That among their most powerful abilities is to co-opt local elites. And that's what I see happening all the time in Alaska. And right, you and your colleagues are the elected representatives of the Alaskan people, not of these companies. Now, they deserve to make money. They deserve success and they deserve a seat at the table, but not every table. And I'm going to say this. So Glen Farm, who are brand new to Alaska, and they're not a giant company. They operate some utility management stuff in South America. They're building, allegedly, or developing a couple of similar projects, smaller in Texas. Nothing that's operating. They don't own and operate anything large. They don't have access to $50 billion. They're not Exxon, right? They're not. And they're sitting at the table in a committee giving their comments in real time to propose amendments to a bill to benefit them. I found that a very ugly and awkward visual.
That's House Resources. And that was like where they would go at ease to ask what Glenfarn thought about a particular proposal. And if Glenfarn said okay, then they would come back on the record and say, this is okay with it. This is okay. We've talked to the company and they're okay with this one.
And that's them. If it were Exxon sitting at the table, it's like, well, Exxon has invested tens of billions of dollars in Alaska for real over the years. They deserve a seat at the table to a degree. I don't think they should actively be manipulating legislation, but at least you could understand why you'd want to hear from them. Who exactly are these guys? The legislature said to Alaska Gasline Development Corporation 2 or 3 years ago in their budget cycle, bring something to us by next year or bring us a plan to dissolve yourself. We are done supporting you. We don't think this is going to happen in our generation. And then they came up with this company that none of us had ever heard of before. And all of a sudden, they are the great savior of what's going to deliver the gas line to Alaska. If only we do these specific things exactly the way they're asking for them. And don't amend it too much, and don't protect yourself on the back end too much. And I can't believe it's gotten this far. And I can't believe that this is what we're forced to talk about next month.
One thing that a staff member said in the building was, when we get a new governor, all of this goes away. We'll go back to just having a normal legislative session. They could be wrong, but that's what they said. They were like, hey, don't get all wrapped up in this, because in November, no matter who the governor is, this whole thing is just going to vanish. Do you think that's right?
If you pass a major piece of legislation, it's hard to pass another one to get out of it. If you give him everything that he wants and the project starts to happen and you realize, oh crap, I made a mistake, how do you claw it back? You start getting accused of instability. Industry loves that.
Right.
That loves to accuse Alaska of instability because we change our systems too much. Until they want us to change it in their direction, then the status quo is what's unstable and that they want. And the problem with the governor isn't that he's a conservative. Conservatives are very competent managers. Some of them do a great job of running governance. I think the governor's problem is his communication skills, and his people aren't authorized to work with the legislature. That there's these lockdowns where the agency people, the leadership, the analysts aren't allowed to communicate with the legislature. You don't know what they really are doing. It's like they dangle bits and pieces of information in front of you and expect you to salute. And it's not an authoritarian system. I would never expect you to salute to anybody. The next governor, if it's of a different personality type, conservative, liberal, or somewhere in between, yes, it will be culturally different around here. But if we bind ourselves to a bill that's going to be hard to get out of, that becomes the starting point. Right now we're from a position of strength and leverage. We do have a very high property tax system. It was built around oil. It was built around oil pipelines and oil fields, an inherently more profitable resource that moves more easily than gas, that requires extremely expensive handling to get across the world. So the oil property tax being applied to a gas pipeline probably isn't appropriate. We need to do something. But while we still have it, we have the leverage to say, I'm going to give this to you, but only if it's worthy and meaningful. Once we give it, it's going to be hard to backtrack from it. So I am concerned that the bill that the governor wants didn't pass on Monday, and it won't pass through this body because neither the House nor Senate majorities are supportive of that aggressive concession. The bill that the legislature can pass, and the differences between the House and the Senate bill are manageable. They both are looking at approximately the same amount of money. Really, most of the differences are in not how big the pie is, but who's cutting it. That there's more local control and more sort of municipal direction of the tax in the House bill, and the Senate has more of a state-controlled system that's divvying out the money generously to the municipalities, but it's very much of a state-controlled system. Those differences can be resolved, but wherever they're resolved, wherever the midpoint between the House and the Senate is, I will guarantee you the governor will veto it because it will be too rich for his blood. And then what happens? You're going to be here all summer. I don't have a good sense of what's going to happen in the next month.
Well, as we finish our conversation, I guess, is there anything I didn't ask you about that you wanted to talk about?
Always, I could talk to you all night, but The most exhilarating days I've had in 20 years here have been the days like Monday. The days, again, where there is a big debate on a big issue that is passionate to me. I have been extremely fortunate and blessed in my time as a legislative staffer in the 17 years, plus my 4 in the administration, to have autonomy, to be gifted by my bosses almost always with the ability to work independently with other legislators on the major issues of the day that are important. And I haven't had to staff the routine bill flow through committees and do a lot of constituent work. And those are very important things and they take a lot of time, but they make it harder to be a specialist. I've been blessed to be allowed to be a specialist. And for that, I'm forever grateful to everyone who's employed me here.
Thank you. Is there a book that you would recommend?
Is there a book that I would recommend? Jack Roderick's book on the early history of the oil industry here is excellent. I think Stephen Haycock's book about the nature of the Alaska economy is the goal is almost trying to normalize us when the money started to happen and create the institutions that regular places have up here in a very extreme environment. I think were very insightful. I'm still trying to get through Ernest Greening's book called The State of Alaska. And that's the one. Once I finish it, I'm going to tell everyone you all have to read.
Well, I will say that I didn't get to interview Jack Roderick for the podcast, but I did have his daughter Libby on. I really wanted to have Stephen Haycock on the podcast. It is like such a tragedy that he died in that bike accident last year. Just like I had seen him the week before, I had the book, and that I think for me, you're my 91st episode in the last 11 months. And I think one reason why I have done so many episodes this last year is because of Stephen Haycock, because I was like, you know what? Anybody that I think I should interview them today because they may not be here next week. And
I had my best friend from high school died about 3 years ago. And it was just a couple of months after my father passed. And we weren't in regular touch. He lived on the East Coast, and I went to Facebook to wish him a happy birthday. And that's where I saw these memorials. He had died 2 weeks before his birthday. And I went to his memorial service, and I remember standing up during the open mic time. And the line was, if people matter to you, keep them. Reach out. Touch the people that are important in your life. Because you never know. You never know when you might lose someone suddenly like that.
So I heard on another podcast, Michelle Obama was being interviewed, and she was asked, or she was talking about her mother passing away and her talking to her mother in the last couple of weeks of her life and asking her mom if she had any big epiphanies at the end of life. And her mom said, I just didn't know it was going to go so fast. And I think, I'm like 10 years younger than you, but I feel like I've reached that point in my life where I kind of realize that there's not as much time left for me as there was behind me. And it goes by fast.
Make every moment count. Don't waste your time on things and people that don't matter. Don't do this for ego, but because you really want to improve the world for the people that come after you. My younger children are going to be juniors in high school next year. As much as I want to work in the next administration and have an important job to help this, I also don't want to put myself in a place where I'm working 100 hours a week and don't see my children in the last 2 years that I know they're going to be living in my house. So these are the things we all have to deal with.
But your plan right now is, fingers crossed, that you'll have a spot in the next administration.
I would like to help the next governor finish the job of the fiscal plan. We got the POMV bill done in the Walker administration. That was historic and essential, and it helped us deal with long-term budgetary needs. What it's also done is de-emphasize the need to look at resource taxation because suddenly it's not as existential as it used to be. That needs a generational tune-up. There are holes in the oil and gas tax system. I'm not saying we have $2 billion on the table. I'm saying there's structural problems that need to get thought through and find a new balance that works, and also one that works for this gas project, which I suspect won't be completed this year. We need to resolve the dividend. The problem with the POMV without fixing the dividend problem was all of a sudden it's become another football, and the biggest football inside the legislative process, and it eats the entire conversation. Every newspaper article about every budget iteration is like, what's the dividend? That shouldn't be part of the conversation. I personally don't care if it's a big dividend or a small dividend, but I think it should be a predictable dividend. I would recommend a percentage of the percentage of market value, and then we'll know what it is. And if that number, if the political census is it's going to be half, it's going to be a big number, it's going to be $2,500, great. Then we need to talk revenue to fill the rest of that hole. We're going to need a broad-based tax at some point. I don't like having to say it because no one wants to be the tax man, although I was the tax man. But eventually we need to have the conversation about what's it going to be, an income tax or a sales tax. There are ideological positions on both sides, but it's a premature conversation. We will have that conversation between income and sales, but first we have to complete the conversation between no and yes. And when we get to yes, we need to do this, we need to do it. So yeah, I would like to help the next governor get Alaska to a long-term fiscal place, because my nightmare for Alaska is that we break the permanent fund. That we've been fortunate that in these 8 years, the temptation to overdraw the fund for any reason has not come to fruition. People have tried. Oh, it's an emergency. Oh, the people need energy relief. Oh, we have this major infrastructure project that needs to happen. We could take more than our 5% just this one time. No, we can't. Once you do that once, you set a precedent. And once you start taking more than it self-regenerates, it becomes a death spiral. And we literally are one generation from rural West Virginia poverty. We will spend it all and it will disappear. We need to protect that fund. I would recommend constitutionalizing the percent of market value and then finding some way to have a stable dividend coming out of it. But that permanent fund needs to be permanent, or we will have failed the generation that came before us, that gifted us with this remarkable legacy. Many resource states suffer from the resource curse, meaning they're left poorer than they started. We are in a position to break that because we have our permanent fund, but it is not protected yet. And until we can get the rest of the way there, we are not protected yet. So yes, I would like to be part of the next generation to get the rest of the way to the finish line.
Hey, one more question. How do you think that this end of session would be going, and these negotiations about the gas line, if President Trump had started a war in Iran?
It made it easier. The budget is often a big contentious thing at the end of a session. It took the pressure off of that. It made it easier for my boss, who's the budget chairman, to work with his counterpart over in the Senate to get to a consensus, spending a little bit more than the Senate was comfortable with, not as much as my boss might have liked, but and obviously we funded a $1,000 dividend last year when we were broke. We needed to realistically come up with a fair number larger than that. Is $1,200 the right number? I'm not certain, but it made the budget easier, which left more time to deal with other things. I don't think we would have been able to deal with the gas line at all if we were really contentious over the budget. We're also able to close some holes that have been pent up. We have a lot of deferred maintenance in the schools and all that. We probably got 5 or 10% of the way towards fixing it, but at least we got 5 or 10% of the way towards fixing it. I don't like having to be grateful for a war, and not just a war. The legislature budgets around the spring revenue forecast that comes out in the middle of March. And I've joked for years, if we're going to blow something up, you really want to blow it up around the 1st of March, because that's when the futures markets are looked at to create the state's official spring revenue forecast. And wouldn't you know it, this president was listening. He started a war on February 28th, just the perfect time to tweak the futures markets and create the paper revenue and the revenue forecast that enabled us to budget a little bit more openly. I hope we're not in the same situation next year just for humanity, but it is easier when there's a little bit more money on the table.
Ken Alper, thank you so much for being on the show, and best of luck with the next 6 months.
Thank you very much, Representative Andrew Gray. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklive.gov or call 907-269-0123.